Welcome to the State Fair Cannabis Awards. And it's just still blowing my mind that here we are in Sacramento in the State Fairgrounds, and it's cannabis. So we just want to share some of our stories and some of the things that we've witnessed and experienced over the years. And I'm Swami. This is Nikki. I guess you know that.
And the actual subject that we're speaking to is cannabis culture rituals, past and present, which is, really appropriate for people like us because we're into rituals and things like that. So, and cannabis is such a psychic plant that it really absorbs and picks up the rituals that are happening around it and carries it through to the effect that you're going to get. We strongly believe in that.
So it says about the past. So I've been doing some research on this, and there's a very famous Greek historian by the name of Herodotus. And if you ever study history anywhere, you'll find out about Herodotus. And he was writing about all the things happening in 300 and 400 BC, right? So, 2,400 years ago. And he went up into what's now the steppes of Russia, and he found this tribe of people called the Scythians. And the Scythians, we get the word scythe from the Scythians. They use this thing to cut stuff down. And so the Scythians, he reported that they would have a ceremonial ritual where they would take 3 sticks and make a little tripod and stick them up. And these sticks, they found some buried with some shamans, some brujos and so on, and they're all got a patina on them. They got markings on them. So they set up this little tripod of sticks, and then they would drape maybe a cloth or skins over the top, and they would create a hot box. So they would take maybe an old stone that had a kind of hollow in it, and take some flowers and put them on the stone, and then put a charcoal from the fire on top of that, and put that inside this little tent they made. And so like 5 or 6 people could stick their heads inside the tent and get hotbox really stoned off this, right? So this is one of the first ways of this sort of ritual. All the people, and of course mostly it was men because they used it when they were hunting. Because if you get everybody stoned all together off the same weed, all of a sudden you got kind of like a mental communication going, almost like a third eye, telepathy. And so when you're out there hunting for your food, you can hear better and see better and smell better and all those things because you just got really high. Besides, you're giggling your head off, and now you got to shut up and go find the game, right? Because you can't chase them away, right? But that's one of those very first rituals, and is a whole thing that has a long history. And so we want to make sure that we don't lose that history, and we celebrate that history, because people have been getting stoned for a long time, everybody, and we want to just keep that going.
So it's also a part of cultures in so many places in the world. In India, obviously, we've spent a lot of time in India. That's how he got to be a Swami. And it's been very, very ancient in their tradition, the cannabis use. And it grows like a weed in India. We used to live in the Himalayas. It's just growing along the side of the road. It's growing everywhere. And in India, they grow it still to this day. It is not sensimilla, so it does have seeds and all of that. But it's on purpose because they use those seeds to cook, because those seeds have protein. And it's actually a great protein source.
Well, they make a chutney with the seeds.
Yeah.
They grind up some mint and some oil, and they grind the seeds into it. And so it's really a food supplement,
Yeah. So there's all kinds of ancient history in India about it. Lord Shiva is the god that is the most associated usually with cannabis. And it all started way back when the gods were fighting over the elixir of immortality, no less. And it was in a copper pot. And they were up in the heavens fighting over this copper pot. And basically, while they were fighting, some things fell out of the pot. I'll let you take over.
Oh, well, this is kind of a creation epic for the Hindu theology. And it was the gods and the demons who were fighting over the elixir of immortality. And once they got this pot full of it, the gods were flying away with it, but they kept the demons because one of the gods turned into the most beautiful woman in the world, and all the demons chased after this beautiful babe. Meanwhile, the gods are flying away with the elixir of immortality. Well, what happened is there's a couple of drops of water fell out, and now they have a holy sacred ritual every 12 years where those drops fell out. And everybody gets together and smokes cannabis and eats cannabis and drinks cannabis and does all these things. But they also do a lot of meditation. They do a lot of chanting. A whole lot of education goes on. So it's this giant festival, and there can be like 60 million people show up for this festival. It makes Burning Man look like a little, walk in the park, right? So, but anyway, this festival is celebrating when they created this elixir of immortality. The drops fell out, but as they were flying over the Himalayas, the gods, 2 seeds fell out. A male seed and a female seed of the cannabis plant, and they fell on the north side of the Himalayas, and that's when the whole thing sort of started. And now it's a sacred thing. And Shiva, Lord Shiva, he's famous for drinking smoothies, cannabis smoothies, right? And that,
and the cannabis smoothies are, they're basically just a lot of weed, and they heat it up somehow, and they make an oil, and they put it in with their
they
yogurt.
make it with clarified butter, and
Yeah.
then they put some spices in, some cardamom herb, and some maybe some rose water and some honey, and they make these beautiful confections, right? That are
and
really stony.
And it becomes a ritual, because when you're doing the cannabis, not just to get stoned, but to get high, to open up your third eye, to gain consciousness and be able to share consciousness on a higher level, that takes it to a whole other level. That's when you're doing ritual with your cannabis.
Well, but see, in those cases, the whole village would eat a cannabis smoothie or actually a cookie. And they don't. And on these certain festivals, it's called Holy Festival. Basically, everybody in the village would eat the same pastry, and they're all now stoned. And then they start throwing colored powder on each other. And they just have this huge wild festival, and everybody you end up colored in totally kind of purple red dyes all over the place, and it's just an amazing thing. And everybody's like,
but they're getting very high, and so it's just to understand. Like here in America, it's been so persecuted for so many years and treated as an evil thing that in other countries it's not like that. So yes, it is illegal now in India, thanks mostly to American influence, unfortunately, but you can still get it at special shops that are in holy cities. So if it's a city that's like right on the Ganges River, for example, or a really sacred place, lots of temples and all that, you're going to be able to go to a little shop, and you can actually buy the weed in flower form, which is not very good because it's not sensimilla. You can also get the hash. That's really what they make the best over there. And if you ask the guy, they got all kinds of things under the table too. But that's basically, it's just such a part of their culture. So on this festival, Holi, that Swami was talking about, the whole family would get high. This would be a thing where they'd wake up in the morning, they'd all have their smoothie, and they just party all day. But they're doing it in a way that they're celebrating the God at the same time.
It's also so much a part of the culture, because up in the mountains it does grow everywhere. And we would be up there and we'd go visit some of the local farmers, and we'd come in, and what do? Their hospitality is very good. So they would make some tea for us, right, chai, and then they would order some biscuits or cookies they would give us from, and then they'd bring out a chillum. And we'd smoke some hash, and that was just considered good manners, that someone came over that you knew was a hash smoker, and you just say, okay, you're here in my house, I'll share some hash with you. So it was so much because it was growing outside, right outside on the terraces, all the pot, right? So it's many different levels there, because in those stores Nikki was talking about, sometimes they sell these things called golis, which means a little ball, and that's totally medicinal. It's an edible. But it doesn't only have cannabis, it has all these other herbs in it for various particular things. So where are we going now?
And so also the chillum, let me just explain what a chillum is. Some of you might not know what a chillum is. It's kind of the shape of this microphone.
Really?
Except it's going to go tapered down a little more and obviously not have the head. And it's a pipe. So it's a conical shaped pipe, usually made out of clay. And in the old days, they would put cannabis in to help, and then they'd put the charas, also known as hashish, on top. And the The flower underneath would help that stay lit and get it really going well. And then you pass this thing around, and the way you smoke it, why don't you hold it while I'm explaining
Well,
it?
yeah, you load up a mixture of hash and tobacco these days, or cannabis, and there's a special way to do it. Since it's just a pipe, you actually would put a cloth around the
Right.
bottom, right? You make that cloth wet to cool it off, and then you go like this. Right? And all of a sudden sparks come out and flames come out, and I tell you, you get one of the best hits you get the best hit you could ever get in your whole life, and you're going to go, all of a sudden the kundalini is going to go right up to the top of the head, and you sort of chill out and say, okay, maintain here, guy. And so it's one of those part of things. Now everybody's now at this other level, and we're all sort of like in this kind of mental space, right?
Yeah. So other parts of the world too, all over. We obviously all of North Africa, all of the Middle East, where they have the hubbly bubblies going and all of that.
Right.
I mean, this has been traditions all through the
Well,
Sufis.
there's Moroccan hash. You may have had Moroccan hash or Lebanese hash, right? Lebanese blonde, right? And then, Afghani hash is really famous. That might be
that was the best.
The strongest, right? But what happens is they'll have a hubbly bubbly, which is a hookah, a water pipe, right? And you'll be walking down the street in one of these tiny villages in Afghanistan, and there'll be a little shop open. There'll be 3 or 4 men sitting around there, and they're passing this hubbly bubbly around, right? They're just sitting out there. They're getting loaded, right, on this hashish, right, which grows just up in the mountains behind them. And such a dry climate up in Afghanistan that it makes actually the best hashish because the big trichomes and so on. So it's just, we used to call it two-toke blackout because if you took 2 tokes on your little pipe and you stood up too fast, right back over.
I guess that's a ritual too.
That's a ritual.
Exactly. And in Jerusalem also. And in fact, they just made some more discoveries recently about finding ancient cannabis remains in Jerusalem. But way back when, they would, and this is talked about in the Bible, they would actually anoint the head,
The altar and
but the person too.
The head priest and the altar
priest.
would be anointed with the holy anointing oil. And one of the ingredients, the ingredients was olive oil and cinnamon and frankincense, and then the stuff that in the Bible they say is calamus. But the calamus, that's a bad translation because in the original Hindu, it says the other ingredient is cannabisum.
Not Hindu, Hebrew.
I'm sorry, excuse me, Hebrew, right. So cannabisum, does that kind of sound like anything that might be familiar, right? So apparently the main ingredient of this holy anointing oil was cannabis oil, right? And so you have a priest who's getting anointed with this oil. Yeah, it goes right through your skin, I mean, really, it's crazy. And so this priest is all of a sudden getting very high, and he's anointing various things with this. And so this is a whole new reading of this part of the Bible. It's somewhat controversial, as you might imagine, but definitely cannabisum is the fragrant reed, and that pretty much describes cannabis. And so likewise, the incense in the inner sanctum was also had cannabis oil in it. You know how sweet hashish smells when you light hashish, right? So now you're walking, you've got oil and your whole cloud in here, and it's like, did I just see God somehow or other? And so it's like this whole way of elevating your Nikki keeps saying, high beyond stone, right? So there's a way in which cannabis goes right up to the third eye, and then from there it can go higher if you take the concentration to make it go higher, right?
And that priest, just so you know, when we say they used it as anointing oil, we're not talking about put a little dab on your head. We're talking about pouring a whole bottle over this guy. Seriously. And that's a lot to soak into your skin. So you know that he's going to then go into some sort of a trance-like state.
Yeah, they actually found a temple I read in a newspaper maybe 5 years ago or so in Jerusalem, and this old ancient tiny little temple had 2 pillars, right? And on those pillars, there was a little thing that was like an ashtray or like a censer, right, for burning incense. And they actually found cannabis resin in those things. So, I mean, it's like it's demonstrative proof that this was being used for thousands of years, right? And just, there's so many ways in which cannabis has been part of our history that we want to keep that alive in this thing. What else are we going to talk about here?
And so now we want to kind of move into the present. Now, of course, in some of those countries, I mean, there's still Babas smoking chillums exactly as they did thousands of years ago. There's still Sufis in the Middle East that are dancing stoned on cannabis as they've always done. That never changed. But as you all know, the reputation was sullied here in the Western world for many years. And so it was really in the probably the 50s it started, 40s, 50s. It was coming back, but that was like the reefer madness days, and everyone was like, ooh, evil stuff, not good.
Yeah.
But then as that changed and we come into the 60s, that's when we really started seeing cannabis being used in a new way, a new rituals, really.
But don't forget that the jazz musicians were always into cannabis, right? And a lot of the people in Mexico and so on. So it was a sort of thing. But what happened in the '60s is all of a sudden, a whole lot of middle class white people started to say, wait a second, I'm not sure I really believe this stuff they're telling me from the government and so on. And maybe I think, wow, let's try this stuff. And so it really became and then it became part of the music scene with rock and roll and all the different groups that were, getting high before they were performing, right? And that's another thing about what, a lot of people don't quite realize that a whole lot of the money behind all that early rock and roll and all the, the Trips Festival and all those other things, that money came from the dealers who were making money selling pot. And they paid for the concerts and everything. They threw big parties, right, to share the wealth. And so it was the idea that, hey, we're all here together and everything, the cannabis raises our consciousness about the music. But then once everybody is in the music and everybody's in the rhythm of the music, then you realize we're all in this group mind. Right? And that's, to me, always that level that cannabis can get you to, where you're in the group mind, where you both have individual expression because you're dancing, but you also know you got this whole wave of sound that's carrying you along, and everybody's in that wave together.
Yeah, no, that's definite. And so Swami and I were blessed. We were both part of the whole hippie revolution in San Francisco. I was born and raised there. He came in '67. So we've really gone through that original breaking out of weed, pot, we didn't call it cannabis back then. And, like I sold my first lid in 1969. You were probably around then,
I sold on 68 on Haight Street. I sold lids on Haight Street. By the way, what is it? The law of, what's it called? The statute of limitations. Right. So I can say that now, but in those days it wasn't so cool to say that.
Yeah, exactly. So, it's also the other thing that's, in those days back then, we didn't call it rituals because we just didn't call it that then. We were just getting high and we were experiencing this. It was from Mexico or south of the border primarily. It was full of seeds and stems. And looking back, this has been an interesting talk to prepare for because it's really made me look back at it now with my much more adult eyes and realize we actually were doing rituals. We just didn't know it. We just didn't call it that. And every time we got out the top of a shoebox, right, the lid of a shoebox, and you'd turn it over and you'd put in your weed because you'd have to shake out all those seeds and stems, that's a ritual.
Yeah.
It really is because now you're going to do that.
Your zigzag little paper thing and you go like this and get this, down the bottom be all these seeds. And that's how people actually started growing too. Because, hey, what am I going to do all these seeds? Yeah, let's go up to Mendocino County, throw them and see what happens, right?
Well, even by accident they found out. But so all of these things were really influencing us in our innocent brains of the time. Of course, we were doing psychedelics and everything else at the same time. So it was a real mind expansion period, let's just say, and it hasn't stopped.
But then the ritual is also, we were always passing the joint, right?
Right.
And that was a whole other ritual that was shared. And so the idea that now we only had a little bit of weed, and we got 6 people, so we roll up a joint and you pass it around, and then that's when other kind of thing realize where you say, oh wow, we're kind of elevating together on this sort of thing, right?
Right. Yeah. No. So that truly was like my personal ritual when I was about 16 years old. Was every Saturday morning I'd wake up, I'd roll myself a bunch of joints, I'd go outside in San Francisco where I lived, I'd stick out my thumb, because that's what we did then, and somebody would pick me up, and it would usually be a car full of hippies. I'd end up spending the whole day with them, sharing the joints. That's what happened. It was something, and it still is something that creates community.
Yeah.
And that's, to me, is one of the best parts about this plant, is that unlike any other plant, I mean, I guess you could say wine grapes bring people together, but not in such a conscious way, I don't believe. So it's just really, it's something that has always brought us together. Hey, you want to smoke a joint? Yeah. Wow, you just have a new best friend.
Exactly.
You know, and that's just how it's always gone.
Yeah, back in those days, had several friends, and we had a light show. We had all these slide projectors, and we'd go and play at the Family Dog and all these different places, right? And so we had all these boxes that had slides in them, right? But every once in a while, we had some dealer friends, and they'd say, hey, man, we just got a whole shipment in. I said, okay, we'll be over. So we went over there, and we would take all of their kilos from Mexico, and we'd put them in our boxes that held the slides. We'd take the slides out. So we'd drive up with our van, and all of a sudden we'll be unloading all these boxes that don't have slides in them anymore. They actually have, kilos of Mexican weed in them. So we were what was called a holding company, right? And because the dealer didn't want to have that many kilos in his place at the time. So we would then say what we charge rent on storing all that weed. And so what we did every morning, we would roll up like 20 joints all at once. I had a little rolling machine, and I just roll up all these joints, and then we'd, like Nikki say, we'd trip around all over the city, pick people up, and by the end of the day, we would have smoked all those joints, right? And so after a certain while, the dealer said, you guys are smoking way too much here, and so they took it away from us. But it was just one of those things where, I mean, we would have a stack of kilos like this, and they were all wrapped up in a certain way, and they had this green and red plastic around them and cellophane kind of thing. And then many years later, a friend of mine says, hey, this friend of mine, he wrote this book, and he was one of the original smugglers, and he started smuggling backpack across the Mexican border by Nogales or something like that, whatever it is, and, maybe 50 pounds in his backpack. He ended up, bringing RVs down to Mexico, bringing sailboats down to Mexico. Eventually, he sailed in from Thailand with, a whole sailboat full of weed. But anyway, he's telling me about these old Mexican kilos he brought in. And he said, really? I remember those. They were covered in this red cellophane, right? And he said, yeah, and we had green cellophane. Oh, yeah. And so I used to buy those kilos from this guy. Now I meet him like 60 years later. He's written a whole novel about this, or actually a biography about this. But it's just that whole thing. It's like, now a whole lot, as many of us old-timers who are still left in that thing, we all sort of know, oh, yeah, okay, that was that time. That was that time. We're now in a new time.
So that was us, the hippies, selling the weed, sharing the weed. But there also were amazing heroes in our city of San Francisco. As you know, Dennis Perone, I'd like to shout out to for sure. This was a man that, again, probably never called what he did ritual, but yet what he did was. He gathered people very bravely at his home where he would get them cannabis for their... he did a lot of it for AIDS patients. That's ritual. That's giving. That's helping people. That's like doing something with a purpose.
Dennis was a veteran, too, a service member veteran, so he's also taking care of veterans. He always wanted people to remember that about him, right, because we got to know Dennis later on in his life. But many, many years ago, in the 60s, early 70s, he had a thing called the Cannabis Supermarket over in the Castro district. And I went there a couple times, and you go up these stairs in this old Victorian, and there would be kind of a big guy at the top of the stairs, and he'd sort of look you over, and you had to come with a friend who already was known there, right? So you come in and you go into what would have been the living room, and now there's mattresses on the floor, and they're covered with kind of Indian bedspreads, and there's a table out here, and on the table are like 6 wooden bowls, and each one of those wooden bowl has a pile of weed in it, ground up weed, right? And this was like the cheap weed, this is the medium weed, this is the expensive weed. And every one of these little bowls would have a couple of joints rolled in it. So if you were going to buy, you had the right to pick up one of those joints and light it up and taste it. You couldn't do too many of them, right? But then the guy was there, and he had a triple beam balance scale, right? Prior to the electronic scale, triple beam balance scale out there, and at this place you could buy $8 of it. You could buy any amount, and he would just say, "Well, calculate. Okay, if you want $7 worth of this," and you would just buy it. And this was like the Superman. Now Dennis got busted, I think, like 12 times or something like that, but he just kept coming back and doing it, right? And then he hooked up with Brownie Mary, and they started making edibles too, right? So I had friends who would make up brownie edibles, and they would go around to offices down in downtown, the financial district, San Francisco, and they'd be selling sandwiches to these people, and they'd also, "Well, I got this other cookie, right, on the side." So they'd be, putting out these brownies and chocolate cookies that were cannabis infused. And that's how it kind of snuck in, because so many people, were actually getting stoned that time, but nobody knew it, right? You had to be really secret about it, right? So here we are celebrating this now in public, and it's like, whoa, man. But that's, we made that happen. We made that happen just by doing it.
And thanks to people like Dennis Perone and
Absolutely,
so many others.
So many
that
others,
really
right?
contributed to that. And, really, again, I just getting back to the whole ritual thing of not calling it that, but that's what it was.
There's also, for the growers, I was just thinking about the hero growers back in the hills. Some of them, got busted, whole families destroyed and so on. But there was the whole ritual of harvest time, right? Ritual of planting. That's when you have to get a bunch of people together at planting in order to get the job done in time, right? And
wait. Let's go back just a little bit first.
We got to go back?
Go back a little bit.
Okay, where are we going?
I'm his editor. So I'm going back to how we got to these mountains to where we've become craft growers. And that happened because there were all of us hippies living in the Bay Area, mostly San Francisco, and it started to get funky. What would have been a beautiful, peace and love sort of situation suddenly started to change to a lot of the bad drugs coming in. Drugs we didn't like to see on the streets, and
Hate
they were
Street
affecting
really
people.
changed, yeah.
Yeah, it got dark. It started to get really scary. So a lot of people there were 2 ways to go. You'd either back to the land movement, which meant you came up to the hills where we still live today, or you went to Asia or somewhere else, or South America. And actually, between
Morocco.
Swami and I, we did it all. But let's first start with the back to the land part, because that's where Swami was going. So imagine this. People pack up their cars. Where are we going to go? Or where are we going to hitchhike, is more like it, with this pack on my back. And you say, well, let's go north. I hear you can get land pretty cheap. We could squat somewhere. Let's see what's happening. People would come up to go see the redwoods in those days.
But the lumber industry was collapsing, so
Yeah.
there was land cheap and free. Not free, but cheap.
Exactly. Land was very cheap. So people started coming up in communes and realizing, if we all put our little pennies together from selling those lids in San Francisco, we can actually buy, 40 acres. And wow, what are we going to do with this 40 acres? Well, we can grow vegetables. We can have animals. While we're thinking about it, let's smoke a joint. Let's roll a joint. Let's drop the seed in the ground by mistake. And oh my God, look at that beautiful plant that just grew. And that's when they realized this was some of the best soil, the best growing conditions in the entire world.
Well, it was
right
also
there.
secret, because you're way up in the mountains on dirt roads and on your back things. So that's another reason why people went up there, because you could get away with it because no one was looking, right?
Right. So once they figured out, let's do this, others started to flock, obviously. The word got out in the hate, like, ooh, go up there, Mendocino, Humboldt. And people just did, and they got great pieces of land for so cheap back in those days.
I just remembered something. We used to have the growers' ball the Cannabis Growers Ball in San Francisco at Bimbo's or something like that, right? And all the big growers would get together and rent the hall and get some bands in and so on. And everybody get all dressed up kind of gangster-like and so on. And we go down there, and we'd even sometimes have a beauty contest. One time we had a recycled materials beauty contest. You had to make your costume out of recycled material. And it was just one of those things, hey, this is in your face. This is all the growers from up north, and we're down here partying because we just sold our crop.
Well, it was about sharing, really.
Yeah.
Because this would have been late 70s into the mid 80s or so. And there was a sense of freedom. People were getting busted, but not as much yet. And we were making a shitload of money, let's face it,
But see, now, when you have
so
to
we wanted to
understand-
share that.
But
with the
growing
people.
out in the mountains in those days, you had to be under the trees, right? Because in the summer it's so dry up there. If you had a bright green cannabis plant out there, it's going to really kind of glow in the dark, more or less, out from up above. So people would grow under the manzanita bushes, under the madrone trees, and so on. And you also had to kind of conceal your paths. You couldn't always use the same path, and you had to find, where am I getting my water? Where am I getting my water? So people are carrying like maybe a 50-pound bag of soil on their back to dig a hole under the manzanita bushes, and you would get like 4 to 5 ounces maybe from each plant. Sometimes other people would grow them right up in the trees. You'd find a little crotch of a tree and put a pot up there, and the problem was getting back up there to feed it and so on. But that meant it was kind of more hidden, right? And so these are things, now you're getting like maybe 3 to 4 ounces off but remember now, at a certain point, a pound of weed up in Mendo was $5,600 a pound, and they would come up with a suitcase full of cash, smoke one joint, and take your whole crop. Now, you might have only had 30 or 40 pounds, but at $5,000 a pound, you're actually making some money. And this is back in the late 70s, up into the 90s, right? So that was worth some money back then. But like I say, it was always underground and crawling through the bushes. We called it ganja boot camp in those days, right? And there were other things. It wasn't just the cops and the sheriff who was looking for you, because there were also marijuana rustlers, I call them. People who come in, find your crop, and then just take all your tops. Just cut off all your tops just before harvest. Thanks a lot, buddy. Right? It's all happened that way. I see Johnny nodding his head back there. Right? So, but see, now that's another thing. 3rd and 4th generation growers, right? Johnny learned from his mom, right, growing out in Bryceland that way. So there's this whole tradition up there. I mean, Casey, he's up there. He's 3rd generation farmer up on Bell Springs Road, right? So, this is the whole thing. And, we get this picture of us as outlaws and criminals and really nasty people. Hey, man, it's farmers and we're families, right? And there's kids, one of my favorite breeders, Mean Gene Jackson, he started growing when he was 7 years old and started making seeds when he was 10, right?
Okay, well, we don't want DCC to hear all of this.
Oh, wait, sorry.
So,
wait,
okay.
statute of limitations. Is this being recorded?
But that actually, that really kind of brings up a point about how, because of the silence that we had to keep amongst ourselves and with the rest of the world especially, that again, to get back to the rituals, that actually created rituals. You would have like your own little superstitions about, okay, if I do this and this to my car when I run the gauntlet driving it down to the city, I'm going to be okay. Or everybody had their own little thing.
Yeah, if you had less than 99 plants, nobody was going to bother you, right?
Yeah, that was a belief. But then there were also things, just because we still were at heart and still are peace and love hippies, that we would do ritualistic things, like go out in the garden on a full moon and dance naked, right? Okay, so, I happen to think that helps the plants, right? Now, okay, we are not allowed now to go naked into our gardens. It's actually in the rules.
Yeah, the state law, right? No, you can't show nipple if because you see they have these video cameras that are doing security stuff, and the people reviewing that, you're not supposed to. No, it's actually written in the state law.
No, it's in the law.
Seriously.
So it's okay. We can go out with our clothes
Just turn
on
the
and
cameras
dance.
off. That's
we
all.
can still do that. Yeah. So, but these are these little ritualistic things that actually, again, getting back to how psychic this plant is, it picks it up. For example, at our ranch, right? We live up above Laytonville. So our garden is planted in the shape of a sacred geometry called the Sri Yantra, which you probably can't see this here, but it's intersecting triangles, and it has lots and lots of philosophy and logic. I mean, you could talk about it for hours. So we are planting our garden in that shape. If you're in a drone, you see that. And we believe that that's going to, like, boom, give a little more juice to the plants.
It actually starts with the seeds. We have a goddess statue of five sacred metals that came from India. And this is the goddess of cannabis who appeared in Mendocino County because the message was given to us: raise the level of appreciation for cannabis into the spiritual level, which it's had for thousands of years, right? And so when we start our plants, we take the seeds and we put them at the feet of the goddess of cannabis, Ganjama. And there's actually a mantra that I was given to say, a sacred chant, to empower those seeds with sacred energy for healing and inspiration, right? And then also, we then take those seeds, and when we sprout them, I put sacred water from the Ganges River, which is called the elixir of immortality, and that goes on to the seeds when they sprout. And so we plant them in the sacred design that Nikki's talking about, and we say the mantra when we plant, and we also put the sacred Ganges water on them. So it's putting an intention onto the plant right from the beginning that the person who's going to get this is going to get the medicine that they need, they're going to get the healing they need, or they're just going to get the inspiration they need, or they're just going to get the giggle time they wanted with their friends, right? And so that's built into the cannabis by the wish we put on it when we put the sacred flower there. So that's our ritual that we have, that we impart that, and that's sacred ritual that comes from ancient years in China when they do Chinese herbs Chinese herbs and also Indian herbs. They also do prayers for them. They plant them according to the moon, the way we do. So you incorporate these sacred rituals into every step of the process, right? And so that the smoking of the joint is again a celebration. And when we really pay attention to smoking the joint, then we're savoring the flavor, we're savoring the texture, we're totally involving all our senses.
Yeah, and I'd say that's actually the next ritual I was going to bring up, which sounds really basic, but it's super important. It's called rolling a joint. And the energy and what you put into that when you roll that joint. Okay, some people roll them better than others. That's okay. If you got a pregnant joint, it's still going to smoke. It's the fact that you put that intention while you're rolling it. You're not just doing it blindly. You're actually really thinking about it. You're grinding it up. You're doing this with real consciousness attached to it. Plus, it takes a lot of time. You're probably talking to somebody while you do it. You're kind of getting into the whole thing. You're building up to the fact you're about to smoke it. That's all ritual practice, really.
I just thought about it in terms of cooking a home-cooked meal. When you cook a home-cooked meal, you're chopping the carrots, you're chopping the onion, you're doing all those things, and you're paying attention to it, right? And you're doing it with consciousness and therefore with love. And when you do the same thing with your cannabis plants and you're smoking, right, then you're involved in the whole process with the tactile sensation, the visual, the olfactory sensation, and you're celebrating this weed even before you smoke it, right? And so that's part of the ritual of awareness. Awareness is part of what ritual really brings you.
Right. And then as you smoke the joint, to be totally aware. I mean, it's sort of like I don't know if you've ever done Vipassana meditation, for example. You're really feeling the energy go through your body. So as you're smoking a joint, you're feeling it go through that joint. And it's going to be different from the start when you first light it to when you get down to that juicy little roach at the end, right? So it's really to just be thinking about that and aware of it and aware of how the flavor's changing as you smoke that joint.
And how your consciousness is changing also, right?
Yeah.
And so for the joint, for me, if it's a really good sun-grown flower, right, and it's totally organic and pure, and you roll it upright and you grind it upright and you're smoking now, there's a journey through the joint. as you smoke the joint, because different flavors, different aromas are triggered at different times through the joint. And a really fine flower is going to give you different flavors as you go through smoking it. And for me, many times that last 3/4 of an inch is going to have the really best, most flavorful hit. But mind you, if you put a tip in, you don't get it. So I never use a tip in any of my joints, and I really recommend you all do the same, because then you get the full flavor of the flower, only mitigated by other flour, not by some rancid cardboard. Anyway, that's my take on it.
So, but of course, in other countries, it's a little different still. Swami and I both did the other route as well. I mean, we did the dropout back to the land thing a little later, because before that, we both chose the route to go overland to India. And so that was back in the 70s. That we both did it independently from one another, although we did know each other already at that point. And boy, I learned a lot about that. Like, for example, going through Europe, you're going to see everybody was rolling their joints into spliffs with hashish and tobacco. And that's just how they do it. You know, it's a very different sort of situation. And then as you keep going, you get into Turkey, Iran. Well, I wasn't smoking weed in Iran, but Turkey and
But I also smoked in Jerusalem. They have good hash in Jerusalem and so on.
Right.
So the Moroccans, they have good hash, and Lebanese, they have hash, and so that was all coming into Europe, into Ibiza, into Berlin, London,
Right.
and all of that, Amsterdam.
And there they'd be using mostly the hubbly bubbly or a pipe.
Well, in
I
Asia,
believe.
and what we call Asia Minor, right, they use the hubbly bubbly, which is a water pipe, and it just everybody there's passing this joint again, but as you're passing the tube around and so on, and it's just people hanging out and smoking. And of course, Morocco is famous for the whole keef, the way they chop it all up in their cafes and so on.
Right.
And so then, but see, it really didn't connect too much to it till we got to Afghanistan. And see, Afghanistan is kind of like, nobody understands Afghanistan, right? Because Afghanistan, even today, is a tribal culture, right? And the tribes are always fighting one another until a foreign invader comes in, and then the tribes all get together to throw the foreign invader out, and then they get back to being tribes again. But there's all these different parts that grow cannabis for hash, right? And it is this black hash. It's called charas there because it's. But they also do the dry sift method there. But it's just so much part of the culture that I was at the border coming across from Iran into Afghanistan. And the next morning, I'm trying to go through customs, and this guy comes up to me at the customs station. He says, "You want to buy some hash, right? Charas." So I'm still in customs, and the guy's trying to sell me hash. That's how much a part of us. Now, Nikki.
Well, yeah, there's
Maybe
the
you
story
shouldn't tell
about
that
getting
story.
busted in Afghanistan, but it's
Anyway,
yeah, there was
so
that.
then,
It was worth it. It was worth it. Believe me, because we had the blessing. We were there, both of us, before.
they still had a
They
king.
still had a king. It was before the
Right.
Russians came in. Anything. It was
So-
really, truly like stepping into Arabian Nights.
There was mostly
It was
horses, very few
amazing.
cars, and just a really tribal society. And you go way back into the mountains, and you don't see any other Westerners, you don't see any cars or anything, and it's just like, it's a whole other culture because it's so barren there. There's no trees unless there's an irrigation canal and they plant them. And up on the hillsides, there'd be these kind of adobe fortresses that, the whole clan would be living up there. So anyway, when we went all the way up into Nepal, Nepal
Right,
has another
yeah.
different kind of culture up there where they're not they're not doing the dry sieve hash like they do in Afghanistan. They're doing the wet hash where they rub off the plant like that. They're rubbing the plants and they get it from the fresh plants and so on. And that's when you get the Malay from Kulu Valley up there. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that was the basic pattern. You went from California or wherever you were in the West, and you went overland through all those countries, Pakistan, and then right into India. And
The
then up
Khyber
to
Pass.
Nepal.
You go through
and
the Khyber Pass. Wow.
Oh my God, what a place that was. Has anybody here ever been to the Khyber Pass? Okay. Really?
Yeah.
It's open?
Wow, amazing.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
in the old days, what it was so you'd be down at the base of it, and there'd be just a bunch of cars, and these were like old American cars, like 1950 Chevys and stuff. Really, big old American cars. And you would get into these cars and they would shove so many people into each car. I actually went over in the trunk. The trunk was open, but I was with another person in the trunk, right? And you go up this road and up this road, and it's, it's
And then you
it's
get to the
amazing.
customs office, and it's this tiny little building.
No. First you get to
Where?
Landi Kotal. You get to Landi Kotal. At the very top of the pass was the place where all the heaviest smuggling went down. And this was an amazing thing. They stopped, it was like a rest stop. You get out of the trunk of the car, you get to stretch your legs. And there were just these kind of pallets with shade cloth over them. And it was like going to a 17th century bazaar somewhere where, the little guy sitting on the ground cross-legged inside. But all that they were selling was either old British Enfield rifles and any other sort of weapons that they had, but it was nothing fancy like they had now. I mean, nothing. This was literally Enfield rifles. And drugs, opium and hash. That's what they were selling. And the entire little market, that's what it was. You buy it and you smuggle it into Pakistan. Wow. That opened my eyes. And then you go down the other side. I mean, it was just amazing. And they drop you off at the bottom, and then you hit the customs office going into Pakistan.
Yeah, well, this is the thing where it's a tiny little building, and behind the guys checking you in, there's a stack of books that's like, 10 stacks, 15 feet high, and those are all handwritten, passport entries and so on. So how they ever found anybody, I don't know. But when I was coming down into Pakistan, I was going from Pakistan to India at the border, and someone had said beforehand, well, when you get to the border, there's this custom agent. He's going to ask you right to your face, do you have any charas, any hash? And so someone told me that, and I had a big chunk in my Levi's I wore at the time. But I'd been forewarned, so he said, "You got any hash?" I said, "Nope, no hash." Okay, go on through. But if you just flutter on that, he's going to search your whole car. But that was a big smuggling route.
So, anyway, that was the first thing that we did that taught us about all of that, and then back to the land movement. But I just want to tell you before we close, we just have a couple minutes left here, about a very important ritual that we do now that is actually a bona fide ritual. And this is something called Namaste. And Namaste was founded by a man named Chris Conrad and his wife, Mickey Norris, who have been very, very supportive of people stuck in jail for many, many years. And Chris is one of those people that acts as
expert witness.
An expert witness, right. So somebody gets busted, Chris will show up and he'll tell them, this person's been in my church. This person is doing this as a sacrament. That's kind of how Namaste started. But now it's actually developed because, praise God, I hope not as many people are going to jail. But what it is we actually have a group of people. We get together, preferably in person. During COVID, it was always by Zoom. And we have a Namaste ceremony. And what that means is that everybody brings weed, we combine it in together, we make huge joints that we pass around, we have a creed that we recite, honoring the plant. This is not tied to any one religion at all, it's just honoring the plant. And then as we smoke the joint, and then we'll stop and we'll talk about it, and what are everybody feeling? Does anyone want to have an intentional smoke in memory of somebody, or some prayers for somebody who's sick in your family, whatever, And so it'll go on for a few hours. And the key is, as you pass the joint, this is really special, and you might try this at home. So, okay, I have the joint.
Yeah, I'll hold this.
Okay, so I have the joint. And I take a hit. Okay, now I got the joint, and I'm going to pass it to Swami. I put my hand over my heart, my right hand over my heart, and I pass it with my left. No, I didn't do that. I put this hand on my heart.
Well, because in Asia, you never touch anything
that's
with
right.
your left
what
hand.
What am I saying? You're right.
Right?
I should have known better.
Yeah.
Okay, you put your left hand on your heart, and then with your right hand, you pass the joint to the next person. And while you do it, you look them in the eye, and you say, Namaste.
Right, and see, it comes from Indian Hindu namaste, which is Sanskrit. Namaste is sometimes translated as, I see the divine in you, or I recognize your higher spirit. And so what we're saying here is Namaste is we're recognizing the high spirit within cannabis and the fact that we're sharing that consciousness in order to raise our consciousness together. And so it's part of the ritual, and then people will bear witness, and then very often at the end we'll chant Om together and things like that. And it's just passing the joint and sharing the flower and making it into an aware thing that we're doing this ritual in order to come together and share and to raise all our consciousness together.
So try it out at home. You'll see it makes a difference just to look into that person's eyes. You know, it really does. So I think on that note, we're about to wrap it up here.
Oh, really?
And,
What's the time?
I know. We could talk forever, and he just had coffee, so, you know, that combination.
I actually
really
had a joint outside, too.
So thanks so much,
Thank
everybody.
you so much for paying attention. And
yeah, lots more
we
to come.
okay there?
Okay. Thank you.